You know, when I was sitting with my coffee this morning reading through the news, and I genuinely had to put the cup down because the sheer scale of what is happening right now, the war, the money, the legal deadline, they just blew past like it was a suggestion on a road sign nobody cares about. It is a lot, and I think most people have not connected all the dots yet. So that is what we are doing today, all of it, Washington to Tehran to Moscow to Beijing, the whole picture. And if you stick with me through this one, I promise you will walk away understanding something that most cable news panels are not explaining properly. So subscribe if you have not already, drop a like, leave a comment, and let us get into this. On the 28th of February of this year, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran, targeting military installations, government facilities, and this is the part that I still cannot quite believe we have collectively processed and moved on from so quickly, assassinating Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself. Not a proxy commander, not a militia figure operating in some disputed territory, but the supreme leader of a sovereign nation, a country with which the United States was, at that precise moment in time, sitting in active diplomatic negotiations over its nuclear program, and Khamenei was killed while diplomats were still talking. While proposals were still being exchanged, while there was by multiple credible accounts, genuine and meaningful progress being made in those very talks, and the fact that the world has largely moved past that detail, that it does not dominate every front page every single morning, tells you something genuinely disturbing about how normalized the extraordinary has become in our current political moment. Because if you strip away all of the geopolitical framing and the strategic language and just state the bare fact, America killed the leader of a country it was negotiating with during the negotiations, it sounds like something from a different era entirely, from a time before international law, before the United Nations Charter, before the entire post-World War II architecture that was built specifically to prevent this kind of thing. And if you are wondering what the justification was for launching this war, well, that is where it starts to get almost darkly comedic, because the Trump administration did not offer one justification, it offered 6 to forestall Iranian retaliation after an expected Israeli attack, to stop an imminent Iranian threat, to destroy Iran's missile capabilities, to prevent Iran from building a nuclear weapon, to seize Iran's oil resources, and to achieve regime change by bringing the Iranian opposition to power. 6 different and sometimes directly contradictory reasons offered by an administration that apparently could not settle on a single coherent rationale before launching one of the most consequential military operations in modern American history. And if you have any memory at all of how the Iraq War was sold to the American public in 2003, with Colin Powell at the United Nations holding up that little vial with the talk of weapons of mass destruction and mushroom clouds and imminent threats that turned out to be entirely invented, then the pattern here should feel uncomfortably familiar, and it should make you appropriately, justifiably suspicious about every official explanation that follows. Now let us talk about where we are 60 days into this conflict. Because the situation on the ground right now is alarming in ways that extend far beyond the original strikes and their immediate aftermath. And the single most important fact that every person needs to understand about what is happening today is this shipping traffic in the Strait of Hormuz has dropped by more than 90% since this conflict began. According to the United Kingdom Royal Navy, which issued a warning that the gridlock in that shipping lane is causing not only a strangulation of international trade, but a looming humanitarian crisis for the roughly 20,000 seafarers currently stuck on vessels in the waterway. 20,000 human beings sitting on ships that cannot move, trapped in a passage that has been turned into a weapon because Iran, in response to being bombed, in response to watching its supreme leader get killed during negotiations, it was participating in good faith, did the one thing it has always threatened to do and close the Strait of Hormuz. And if you want to understand why that matters in concrete, practical terms that go beyond the abstract language of geopolitics, consider that around 20% of global petroleum and 20% of liquefied natural gas traverses that strait every single year. That before this conflict began, around 3,000 vessels used it every month, and that number now stands at around 5% of its previous level. 5%, and international oil prices have climbed past $100 a barrel. And none of that is accidental. None of it is collateral damage in any meaningful sense. That is Iran's strategy, Iran's chosen weapon in a conflict it knows it cannot win conventionally. And whether you think that strategy is justified or not, whether you think Iran is the villain or the victim in this story, or some complicated combination of both, the strategy is working, and the world is feeling it. And into this situation, this 60-day-old war that Congress never authorized, this global economic disruption, this diplomatic standoff with no clean resolution on the horizon, walks Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary of the United States, going to Capitol Hill this week, not primarily to answer for what has happened, not to give a reckoning, but to ask for more money, specifically to ask for the largest sum of money any Pentagon chief has ever requested in the history of the American Republic, because Hegseth appeared before both the House and Senate Armed Services Committees to push for a $1.5 trillion budget request for the fiscal year 2027, a request that includes $750 billion for the so-called Golden Dome missile defense system, $102 billion for aircraft procurement and research and development, close to $75 billion for drones and counter-drone technologies, and $65 billion to build 18 new naval vessels. And before you even begin to process what $1.5 trillion actually means in the real world, and most humans minds genuinely cannot picture a number that large. You need to know that this budget was calculated before the Iran war even started, meaning it does not account for a single dollar spent since the bombs started falling on February 28 because the calculations were finalized months before the conflict began. And on top of that already historic figure, the Pentagon has separately indicated it intends to ask for an additional $200 billion in supplemental war funding to cover the ongoing costs of the campaign. So we are genuinely seriously talking about numbers that should prompt every taxpayer and every elected representative to ask some very hard questions about where all of this money is going and who decided that this is how it should be spent. What has the war officially cost so far? Jules Hurst III, the Pentagon comptroller, testified before Congress that the figure to date is $25 billion, with the majority of that expense driven by the thousands of bombs and missiles used in the campaign, though it is worth noting that multiple lawmakers on Capitol Hill believe the true figure is considerably closer to $100 billion, and that the official number deserves significant skepticism. And yet, despite all of this, despite the tens of billions already spent and the hundreds of billions being requested, the administration has still not submitted a formal supplemental spending request to Congress, has not gone to the institution that the Constitution in Article 1, Section 9 explicitly charges with control over the national treasury, and said, here is what this war costs, and here is what we need to continue it. And the reason they have not done that is the same reason they have avoided doing a lot of things in this conflict, because submitting a formal spending request would require formally acknowledging that they are prosecuting a war that was never authorized by Congress, and that is a conversation they are determined to never have in any official capacity if they can possibly avoid it. Which brings me to the constitutional crisis that is sitting right at the center of everything happening right now. The crisis that is in some ways more alarming than the war itself because of what it means for every future conflict and every future president and every future moment when the executive branch decides the law applies to everyone except itself. And this crisis revolves around a piece of legislation called the War Powers Resolution of 1973, a law that was born out of the catastrophe of Vietnam, passed by Congress over the explicit veto of Richard Nixon, who argued that it constrained the president's ability to protect the country, and was told by Congress in the clearest possible terms that that was precisely the intention, and what that law says in language that requires no legal expertise to understand is that the president must give formal notification to Congress within 48 hours of introducing American forces into hostilities. And that notification starts a 60-day clock. And at the end of those 60 days, the president must terminate the use of force unless Congress has either declared war or explicitly authorized the military action. And this is not a technicality, not a procedural footnote. This is the foundational mechanism by which the American constitutional system is supposed to ensure that the decision to take the country to war rests with the legislature that represents the people and not with a single individual in the executive branch. And it was designed with exactly this kind of situation in mind. Trump notified Congress on the 2nd of March, which made yesterday, the 1st of May 2026, the 60-day deadline. And what did the administration do when that deadline arrived? The White House sent a letter to Congress declaring that hostilities with Iran have, and I am quoting the president's own words, terminated, with Trump writing to House Speaker Mike Johnson that the hostilities that began on February 28th have terminated, and yet in the very same letter making it unmistakably clear that the conflict may be nowhere near over, writing that despite the success of United States operations and continued efforts to secure a lasting peace, the threat posed by Iran to the United States and our armed forces remains significant. And I want you to hold both of those sentences in your head at the same time and ask yourself honestly whether they are compatible, because the war is over, but the threat is significant. Hostilities have terminated, but the forces remain in the region. The fighting has stopped, but the United States is maintaining a naval blockade of Iranian ports and threatening to resume strikes if negotiations fail. And no reasonable reading of the English language or of the War Powers Resolution supports the idea that a ceasefire, a fragile, contested, repeatedly violated ceasefire that both sides acknowledge could collapse, constitutes the termination of hostilities under a law specifically written to prevent presidents from using exactly this kind of creative wordplay to evade requirements. Pete Hegseth sat before the Senate Armed Services Committee a day before that deadline and told senators with apparent confidence that the 60-day clock pauses or stops in a ceasefire. And Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, who is a lawyer and has actually read the statute, responded clearly that he does not believe the statute supports that interpretation and that he has serious constitutional concerns. And then Trump himself went a significant step further, suggesting publicly that the War Powers Resolution of 1973 is unconstitutional, which is a remarkable position for a man who swore an oath to uphold the Constitution to take regarding a law that has been on the books for more than 50 years. And J.D. Vance had already made the administration's real position crystal clear before the war even began, stating openly that the War Powers Act is fundamentally a fake and unconstitutional law and that it is not going to change anything about how the administration conducts foreign policy. And there you have it, stated plainly by the vice president before a single bomb was dropped. The law Congress passed specifically to prevent unilateral presidential warmongering is in their view, not real, which is a remarkably convenient thing to believe when you are about to launch a war without seeking anyone's authorization. And what did Congress do when the 60-day deadline arrived? Democrats tried to invoke congressional authority over this war through war powers resolutions 6 separate times, and 6 times Republican senators blocked them, and then Congress packed its bags and went on a week-long recess, left town, went home, while an unauthorized war with a legal deadline expiring in their absence was being prosecuted in their names with their constituents' money. And Representative Adam Smith of Washington, the ranking Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, described the situation with the exhausted clarity that should disturb every person who cares about the health of democratic institutions, saying that the expectation that the Trump administration is going to follow the law is an expectation he simply does not have, and he said it without apparent shock or outrage, because that is the world we are living in now. A world where the senior Democrat responsible for military oversight in the House openly states that he does not expect the executive branch to follow the law, and says it as though it were a perfectly ordinary state of affairs. Now let us zoom out from Washington and look at the global picture, because this story does not begin and end in congressional hearing rooms. And you genuinely cannot understand where any of this is headed without understanding who all the players are, what each of them wants, and how each of them is reading a situation that is still very much in motion. And I want to start with Iran, because Iran's position is more strategically coherent than most Western media coverage has been willing to acknowledge. Iran was attacked during negotiations by the 2 countries it was negotiating with, watched its supreme leader get killed, saw its military infrastructure severely damaged, and its response was not to capitulate, not to come to the table on American terms, but to close the Strait of Hormuz, launch hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles at Israel and American military bases and at Arab countries across the region, and then dig in for a war of endurance, betting that the economic pain caused by the strait closure, combined with the political costs of an unauthorized war in America, would eventually erode American political will faster than Iranian resolve. And when you look at a Congress that cannot enforce its own war powers law, when you look at Trump's approval numbers on the war beginning to soften, when you see the administration desperately trying to declare victory while simultaneously threatening to resume bombing, you begin to understand why Tehran might believe that bet is paying off. Iran rejected the American 15-point peace plan delivered through Pakistan, with Iranian officials making clear that Iran will end the war when it decides to do so and when its own conditions are met. And Iran's counter-proposal demanded an end to all American and Israeli attacks, security guarantees against future aggression, war reparations, and international recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. And that last demand is something Washington will never accept. And both sides know it, which is why this ceasefire is not a peace and has never been presented as one, even by the people who brokered it, with J.D. Vance himself calling it a fragile truce. And when Trump told reporters this week that Iran wants to make a deal, but he is not satisfied with their proposal, what he was communicating is that the distance between the 2 positions remains enormous, and that the window for a negotiated settlement is narrower than either side is publicly admitting. Israel's position deserves careful attention because it is more complicated than the simple image of a united coalition acting in lockstep with Washington, because a poll conducted by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem found that most Israelis oppose the ceasefire, with 39% believing Israel should continue attacks on Iran and only 41% saying Israel should respect the ceasefire. And meanwhile, Israel has continued military operations in southern Lebanon, despite a separate Lebanon ceasefire brokered by the Trump administration, with Hezbollah and Israel accusing each other of near-daily violations. And what this tells you is that Israel is simultaneously fighting on multiple fronts, has no clear endgame on any of them, and is acutely aware that if American political will on the Iran war weakens and Trump decides he wants his deal and wants to move on, Israel could find itself exposed, having co-launched a war whose next chapter may not unfold on terms favorable to its security. Russia's role in this conflict is in the most coldly rational and deeply cynical way imaginable, almost elegant, because Russia has positioned itself to profit from every possible outcome without committing to a single course of action that could directly cost it anything. And the core of what Russia is actually doing is this. Moscow has been supplying Iran with real-time intelligence data on American warship and aircraft positions, enabling more precise Iranian retaliatory strikes, providing satellite feeds that help Tehran monitor American movements across the Middle East. All of this without deploying a single Russian soldier or firing a single Russian weapon. And the financial dividend from the conflict is staggering, with estimates suggesting Russia could see additional budget revenues ranging from $45 billion to $97 billion as a direct result of soaring oil prices caused by the Strait of Hormuz closure. And Putin is sitting in Moscow watching American munitions get depleted, watching American diplomatic credibility erode, watching Gulf states that spent years slowly aligning with Washington grow anxious and uncertain. And every day this war continues is a strategic profit for a Russia that has been squeezed by Western sanctions and grinding through an expensive war in Ukraine. And the deeper game is that Russia is using this conflict as a demonstration to the entire global South that American power is unpredictable, that American legal frameworks are selectively applied, and that the Western-led international order is not the stable foundation it presents itself as. China is doing something more sophisticated still, pursuing what serious analysts have started describing as strategic patience disguised as principled neutrality, because China condemned the assassination of Khamenei, called it the blatant killing of a sovereign leader, coordinated with Russia to convene emergency United Nations Security Council sessions, vetoed alongside Russia a Bahraini-drafted resolution calling for an end to Iranian attacks on shipping, and then stopped there, deliberately, carefully, because China does not want to be seen as a co-belligerent, does not want to give Washington a pretext to escalate or impose further economic penalties, and is instead playing a longer game, letting America exhaust its missile inventories and diplomatic capital in the Middle East, while Beijing quietly consolidates its strategic position in the Pacific, because every aircraft carrier America deploys to the Persian Gulf is one fewer aircraft carrier near the Taiwan Strait. Every interceptor missile fired over Iran is one that cannot quickly be restocked for a potential confrontation with China. And the Center for Strategic and International Studies noted with characteristic understatement that while America has enough munitions to continue this war, the risk is with future wars, particularly against a peer competitor like China, and Beijing has been stockpiling petroleum reserves sufficient for more than 120 days, meaning China prepared for a prolonged Hormuz closure before most Western governments had fully processed that the war was even happening. Pakistan has emerged as perhaps the most surprising consequential actor in the entire drama, because Pakistan is simultaneously deeply tied to China through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and deeply dependent on American military and economic relationships, a country that has historically struggled to navigate the space between those two powers, has somehow managed to position itself as the essential intermediary in the most important diplomatic negotiation on Earth, delivering the American 15-point proposal to Tehran, co-sponsoring a separate Chinese-Pakistani 5-point peace initiative, and hosting talks in Islamabad that represent the only serious diplomatic channel still genuinely open between the two sides. And whether Pakistan has enough credibility with both Washington and Tehran, enough institutional capacity, and enough genuine leverage to shepherd an agreement through all of the competing red lines and demands, is one of the most consequential and least discussed questions in global affairs right now. The Arab Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, find themselves in a position that is genuinely, structurally impossible, having spent years slowly normalizing relations with Israel, accommodating American power projection, building economic and security partnerships that were supposed to represent a new and more stable Middle Eastern order, and then watching all of that get shattered when Iranian missiles and drones started landing on their territory in retaliation for a war they did not ask for and did not want. And these countries cannot break with Washington because American security guarantees are the only credible deterrent they have against Iranian military capabilities, but they also cannot fully embrace a war that is causing economic disruption, threatening their infrastructure, closing a shipping lane their own economies depend on, and whose endgame no one in Washington can clearly articulate. And the head of the United Arab Emirates State Oil Company said this week that the Strait of Hormuz is not open and needs to be open unconditionally, which is not the statement of a comfortable ally, that is the statement of a government that is deeply, seriously alarmed. The Atlantic Council recently laid out the worst-case scenario with a clarity that deserves wide attention if the ceasefire fails to produce a comprehensive settlement and Chinese support for Iran shifts from passive economic opportunism to something more substantial, involving expanded material assistance, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic cover that shields Tehran from further international pressure. Then the Sino-Russian-Iranian alignment deepens into something approaching a formal strategic coalition. Sanctions regimes fracture as American allies in Europe and Asia prioritize their own energy security over geopolitical solidarity with Washington. A third major theater of global contestation opens alongside Ukraine and Taiwan. Prolonged energy shocks drive a global recession, and Moscow, Tehran, Beijing, and Pyongyang cohere into a revisionist coalition with genuine systemic weight capable of challenging the entire post-World War II international order. And the duration of disruption to the Strait of Hormuz, the Council noted, is the single most consequential factor in determining whether the conflict's effects remain regional or become truly systemic and generational. And at the center of all of this, Pete Hegseth sat before Congress this week and described the American airstrike that killed more than 165 people at an Iranian elementary school, many of them children, as an unfortunate situation still under investigation. And Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York asked him directly what his response is to targeting that resulted in the destruction of schools and hospitals and civilian places, and why he cut by 90% the very division within the Pentagon whose job it is to prevent civilian casualties. And Hegseth did not have a satisfying answer, because no satisfying answer exists, because the division responsible for preventing exactly this kind of civilian harm has been gutted by 90%, and children are dead in a school, and the man running the Pentagon calls it an unfortunate situation, and Congress went on recess. This is the world right now, and I want to leave you with something that Foreign Affairs magazine, not a radical publication, not an outsider voice, one of the most establishment foreign policy journals in the United States, put plainly in a recent piece, which is that the test of American statecraft is not whether it can destroy targets in Iran, But whether it can shape an outcome in which Iran is reintegrated into the global economy and no longer poses a major threat to its neighbors, in which regional states feel less compelled to hedge toward Beijing, and in which Moscow is denied another geopolitical gift, and by every single one of those measures, right now, today, the United States is failing that test because the Strait stays closed, oil stays above $100, Russia profits, China maneuvers, Iran digs in, the Gulf trembles, Pakistan mediates without the power to compel, and Congress went on holiday after failing for the 6th time to enforce a law that has been on the books since 1973. Subscribe to this channel, like the video, share it with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening, and tell me in the comments what you think the endgame looks like, because I read every single one and I genuinely want to know. And the only way any of this changes is if enough people understand it clearly enough to demand that it does.